Hello and welcome to lecture number 29. This is topic 2.18, debates about immigration, colonization, and belonging in America. The first of two learning objectives is to explain how 19th century immigration aimed to achieve the goal of Black freedom and self-determination. Immigration is sometimes also called part of the colonization movement and wanted to transport free blacks in the United States to other parts of the world where slavery was not practiced to slowly do away with the institution of slavery in the United States. The first organization of this kind is the American Colonization Society, established in 1861 by a white clergyman named Robert Finley. He was inspired by the work of black businessman named Paul Cuffey, who had attempted to establish a colony in West Africa. We'll talk more about Cuffey in a later slide, but the Colonization Society had brought support amongst white abolitionists and also amongst plantation owners and enslavers because it meant that a free black influence in the United States would be removed and thus slavery could be bolstered. In the minds of the abolitionists, they believed that they could slowly help people buy their freedom and then go to Africa to live out the rest of their lives. They received a $100,000 grant from Congress in 1819 since it had many supporters who were politicians and governors, including Henry Clay and the then President James Monroe. It did have some black supporters, but generally the Colonization Society was received with suspicion, thinking that it was a massive plot to remove all black people from the United States. There were African American immigrants drawn to countries that abolished slavery. We'll talk more about those areas in the next slide, but they wanted to create new communities outside the United States and were hopeful that they could escape slavery and racial discrimination. Those who supported colonization believed that they would never be able to be accepted by white Americans in the way that they deserved, so it was better to just escape and move to a different place. This sentiment was heightened after the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which decided that anyone of African descent was not a citizen and was not intended to be a citizen by the founders and writers of the foundational documents of the country. The Dred Scott decision significantly impacted the African American community's sense of belonging and citizenship in the United States, reinforcing the belief that emigration was a viable option. This inspired people like Henry Highland Garnet to create the African Civilization Society, which was itself a colonization society that attempted to resettle people in Yorubaland, which is modern-day Nigeria. Places that emigrationists looked for as possible candidates for relocation were those that had large populations of Afro-descendants, shared histories, and advantageous climates. Three main areas rose from this: West Africa, Haiti, and Latin America. The initial efforts were focused in Sierra Leone by Paul Cuffey. Later on, the American Colonization Society established a colony in the country of Liberia in 1821. And by 1847, Liberia declared its independence and became a republic. However, the growth of the colony of Liberia was not as great as the population growth that the black population in the U.S. experienced through the same period. Haiti was also another candidate. It was close to the United States, and they had abolished slavery there after they won their independence from France. Haiti's successful slave revolt and subsequent abolition of slavery in 1804 made it a beacon of hope for the enslaved people worldwide. However, the people who relocated to Haiti found the Catholicism, the language, and culture very foreign to them, so it wasn't necessarily the best place for them to consider. Finally, Latin America was another option. Henry Highland Garnet, who created the African Civilization Society, also considered Mexico as a possible place to go. Two prominent immigration supporters were Paul Cuffey and Martin Delany. Paul Cuffey was a black abolitionist from Massachusetts. He had a Quaker background and also had a Native American wife. He took 39 people to Sierra Leone in 1815. The colony of Sierra Leone had been established by the British in 1787 as a free settlement where they resettled exiled black loyalists from the Revolutionary War who had previously spent time in Nova Scotia, Canada. When Cuffey arrived in Sierra Leone, he was not allowed by the British to unload the cargo he brought to sell and subsist in the colony. So that colonization attempt was largely a failure, and he returned to the United States. 2 years later, in 1817, he died. Cuffey's efforts, despite their ultimate failure, highlighted the complexities and challenges of early colonization attempts. Martin Delany had actually gone to West Africa and explored sites for colonization, but he paused his attempts at creating a colonization endeavor with the breakout of the Civil War. After the Civil War and the implementation of Jim Crow and black codes all across the South, he started to be active again in the process of colonization. He became an official in the Liberian Exodus Joint Stock Steamship Company, which was trying to raise money to send more people to Liberia. He also wrote The Principle of Ethnology in 1879, which promoted Black unity and Black pride. He theorized in the early chapters about the origin of race and stated that he believed that everyone came from the same origin and that things like skin color developed from adaptation to one's environment. He also tried to dispel any notions that Africa wasn't a historical place and detail some of the achievements of Black civilizations in Africa before European contact. Delaney's work underscored the importance of African heritage and identity in the broader struggle for Black self-determination and pride. The second learning objective says to explain how transatlantic abolitionism influenced anti-immigration political views about the potential for African Americans belonging in American society. The anti-immigration movement believed colonization was a movement devised by white Americans to forcibly remove all Black people from the United States after they had worked and been exploited to increase the wealth of the country. They thought that abolition and racial equality reflected the nation's ideals, and therefore they should be liberated, have political representation, and be fully integrated into the American society. To put it shortly, they wanted to be full citizens. They wanted full citizenship rights that they believed were due to them by virtue of being born in the United States. This wouldn't become a formal right until the adoption of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. Even then, in southern states, the protections guaranteed by the 14th Amendment were under attack by the redeemed governments in the former Confederate states. Some examples of anti-immigrationists in somewhat chronological order started with James Forten, who was in Philadelphia and helped voice the discontent of the Philadelphians with the American Colonization Society. Samuel Cornish was the co-founder of the country's first Black newspaper called Freedom's Journal. His distaste for colonization actually led to the dissolution of the paper because his co-founder was a lot more open to the idea. Finally, David Walker published Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1830. Walker's pamphlet was a groundbreaking work advocating for Black empowerment and resistance to oppression, and it significantly influenced the abolitionist movement. In his pamphlet, he devotes an entire chapter discussing as to why emigration is wrong and should not be done. Another reason people might have decided to emigrate out of the United States was less ideological and more practical. Any former enslaved person or abolitionist that fled or ran away to claim their freedom was still at risk of recapture due to Fugitive Slave Acts. The first one was passed in 1793 with the intention to create protections for the institution of slavery. Some abolitionists who escaped slavery found refuge in England and Ireland. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was the most strict because it put Northerners in jeopardy who didn't aid in the recapture of fugitive slaves, not to mention those who helped harbor and give refuge to fugitive slaves in the North. Additionally, fugitives were to be brought before a judge to certify that they were indeed runaways. The law made it so that the judge would be paid twice as much if they deemed the person before them as a runaway. You can see from the ad on the screen that there was a real, genuine fear amongst Black Americans in the South that they will be re-enslaved, or even worse, that they would be wrongfully kidnapped and enslaved despite being born free. Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous abolitionist of the 19th century, himself escaped slavery in 1838. He was on an international speaking tour in Ireland and Britain from 1845 to 1847. One of the reasons why it lasted so long was because he was fearful of recapture upon his return. His notoriety had become so large and his story so public that it was likely that his former enslaver could at any point hire a slave catcher to re-enslave Frederick Douglass while he was on the speaking tour. In 1847, he finally returned to the United States with 500 pounds that was given to him by his supporters in Great Britain so that he could purchase his freedom. For reference, the modern figure of the equivalent 500 pounds would be somewhere around $57,000 in today's dollars. Douglass's return and his purchase of freedom highlighted the transatlantic support for abolition and the interconnected nature of the movement. Another abolitionist who emigrated to Britain was William Wells Brown. He wrote Clotel, or the President's Daughter, a fictional account of slave children fathered by Thomas Jefferson. His relationship with Sally Hemings, after all, was never a well-kept secret. Some of the common criticisms by the 19th century anti-immigrationists were that American ideals should have guaranteed equal rights and freedom for all, and the exclusion of millions from citizenship because of race while simultaneously profiting from their exploitation was wrong. This was highlighted in both the colonization movement and the country's celebration of holidays like the 4th of July. In Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, David Walker in 1830 devotes an entire section of his book to opposition for the colonization movement and says that America is more our country, referring to Black people, than it is to whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears, making the case that after everything they've done to make the country as rich as it is now, people want to dispense with them and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Frederick Douglass highlighted the hypocrisy in the holiday of Independence Day in his speech titled, "What to the American Slave is Your 4th of July?" delivered on July 5th, 1852 in Rochester, New York. The picture on the screen is what Douglass looked like in 1852 and the venue of the speech. He called attention to the hypocrisy of this holiday in the face of slavery that continued to be practiced. He pointed out some of the elements in the Declaration of Independence and argued that they rang hollow. His words declare, "Your shouts of liberty and equality, a hollow mockery." And finally, here's the recap. Immigrants sought alternative locations to move to as more countries abolished slavery. Attempts at colonization in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Haiti in the 19th century took place. Paul Cuffey and Martin R. Delaney were major figures who supported emigration. Anti-emigrationists were suspicious of colonization attempts and believed that they were due equal rights in their home country. Fugitive Slave Acts made it harder for abolitionists to organize, and some sought refuge in Britain and Ireland. Finally, anti-emigrationists highlighted the hypocrisy of Americans in celebrating independence while also practicing slavery. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.